What's up, design family, and welcome back to another episode of Fittdesign TV. So glad to have you guys back on the channel. On today's episode, I'll be giving you guys the definitive guide, the beginner's guide to understanding textiles. I'll be covering a ton in this episode, but I'll keep it short and I'll keep it extremely to the point. Basically, we'll be covering a bunch of different parts of the textile world. By the end of this episode, you're going to walk away with a much better understanding. You're going to be one of those people that even when they see a fabric or when they feel a fabric, you might know what the composition is and ultimately why it is as such. We'll be covering the following topics in this episode. We'll be looking at the construction life cycle of an actual fabric. So how a fabric is made and how it goes from being a raw material all the way to the finished fabric. Then we'll also look at the different families of fibers that are used to make the many different fabrics we see on the market. We'll also look at the different construction techniques. Different fabrics are constructed differently, and even within these different construction techniques, there are sub-construction techniques. And then we'll look at the different types of finishes. When you have the actual fabric, the piece of fabric, what types of finishes can you apply? A 100% polyester fabric from supplier X may look completely different and feel completely different than that from supplier Y. Why is that? Well, on this episode, we're going to find out. And lastly, we'll look at how to spec a fabric from start to finish and understand the core different components that you'll want to actually notify and actually mention in your fabric composition. So if any of this sounds interesting to you, buckle up, guys. You guys are in for a good one. What's up, design family, and welcome to Fittdesign TV. So glad to have you here. On this channel, we discuss all things sports fashion, graphic design, manufacturing, and technology. We'll discuss key topics, answer pressing questions, and provide actionable steps on starting your own product line. If you're interested in any of the above topics, stick around. You're in for a good one. Let us start off at the beginning. How is any fabric made? Well, all fabrics, as with anything in life, are made from raw materials. Raw materials come from a variety of different sources, but just know that the construction life cycle of any fabric is almost identical. We start off with the raw material. If it's cotton, obviously we're working with the cotton plant. We take this cotton plant and we extract the fibers. We then use these fibers and we spin them, and there's a variety of different spinning methods that we can use to turn these fibers into yarns. The yarns are then either knitted or woven into the finished fabric. And we can actually do a ton with that finished fabric when it's over. We can apply finishes to it, we can dye it, and we can actually do a ton of actual physical things to the fabric to enhance its performance, its touch, and its feel. The second core component that you need to know if you want to understand and you want to master the world of textiles is what are the different families of fibers that are available to me. Obviously, you know the main ones. You know, okay, cotton and polyester. Well, those are actually not families of fibers. Those are very specific fibers. Cotton is a very well-known natural fiber versus polyester, which is an extremely well-known synthetic fiber. There's actually three core families that you guys need to know. We have our natural fibers, we have our synthetic fibers, and then right in the middle, we have our semi-synthetic fibers. What are some examples of each of these families? Well, when it comes to our natural fibers, cotton is going to be a very well-known one. We also have wool, we have silk, we have cashmere, so on and so forth. The types of natural fibers that we find on the market are pretty much anything that we can get from a natural source. All the way on the extreme, we have our semi-synthetic fibers. Those ones, well, we know that we have our synthetic fibers, and then in the middle, we have our semi-synthetic fibers. So all the way on the other side, we have our synthetic fibers. These are things like polyester. Polyester is actually an oil-based synthetic fiber, and we get them from oil pellets. A lot of our synthetic fibers are actually based and sourced from oil-based compounds, which is why typically we say that synthetic fibers are not the best for the environment. There's also a ton of other production methods that go into synthetic fibers that add to their lack of sustainability. But obviously with modern production methods, you can achieve a higher level of sustainability and zero emissions, but that's another topic for another episode. So synthetic fibers, what are they? Well, again, these are things that we produce using man-made processes and we extract from things like oil pellets. These are things like polyester, nylon, Those are some of the two most common synthetic fibers, and there are a ton to choose from, like acrylic, so on and so forth, that we go into detail in a separate episode that I highly recommend you check out. And then right in the middle, we have our semi-synthetic fibers. These are sourced from natural resources like a tree bark in the case of viscose, and we actually apply man-made methods to them in order to turn them into the fibers that we use in our finished textiles. So that's a quick recap: natural, semi-synthetic, and all the way synthetic. The third key category when it comes to understanding fabrics is their construction. How are these fabrics actually constructed? Well, there are two core construction techniques that have been pretty much used since the beginning of time. On the one hand, we have our weaving. Most woven fabrics, or all woven fabrics, are done on a traditional loom where you have your weft and your warp yarns that are interlaced together, creating the finished actual garment or the actual finished fabric. When it comes to different types of weaving methods, well, there are a ton, and we've gone into detail in a separate episode that I highly recommend you check out. But just know that you have things like your plain weave, you have your basket weave, you have your actual twill weave. Twill weave is very well known to be used in things like your denim pants, right? It's characterized with this diagonal lines going down the middle. Also, we have a ton of other types of weaves that you can get into that are subcategories into each of these different types of weaves. But just know that each one has its own characteristics and each one has its own performance. The most common that we see on the market are basket weaves, plain weaves, and twill weaves. On the flip side, we have our knitted fabrics. Knitting, if you were to kind of think about it, is what you think of when you think of an old lady sitting on a couch or sitting on a chair and she's knitting something. She's knitting a scarf or she's knitting a sweater. Essentially, what she's doing is she's taking really large yarns and she's knitting them together into these interlaced, sort of like these upside down H shapes. The process of knitting is quite common. And actually, when it comes to a lot of garments that we see in the sportswear market and in the general mass market, knitted garments are going to be the most popular. You get a lot of stretch out of knitted garments. They're very cheap and easy to make, and ultimately they are a little bit more durable than woven fabrics, which tend to unravel much more easily than knitted garments. So on the two extremes, we have our woven fabrics and we have our knitted fabrics. In the family of our knitted fabrics, which also all tend to have a lot more stretch than their woven counterparts. And again, we've done a separate video in the past where I've actually taken a lot of different examples of knitted and woven fabrics and compared them side by side and expressed what are the core characteristics of each and in which specific situation you would use each of the two families. But when it comes to knitted fabrics, you have your single jersey knit or your plain knit. This is the most common type of knit, and it's very cheap, very easy to make, and it's readily available. You have your double jersey knit, which is sort of a doubling up of the knit structure. It's more structured, it's a bit more heavier weight, it doesn't curl at the edges, and this leads us into our interlock knit. Our interlock knit has a lot more structure than both the double jersey and the single jersey knit. It's very popular on outerwear, especially in sportswear, and it's a little bit more expensive, but it doesn't have a wrong face or a right face. And it's just a great all-around constructed fabric. Then you have your rib knits, and you have a bunch of your other full treacle mesh knits. You have your warp knits and your weft knits, but we won't get too much into episode or too much into detail in this episode. That's been an episode we've done in the past that I highly recommend you check out. Next up, now that we've actually constructed our finished fabric, we have our piece of fabric in our hand. Well, does that mean that that's all we can do to our fabric? Well, not quite. We can do a ton of different mechanical and chemical finishes to actually change a lot of the characteristics of the fabric. We can change the functionality of the fabric, how it performs in its stretch, in its water resistance, in its odor resistance. We can actually change the hand feel of the fabric. If you've ever had a plush hoodie, right? You feel on the outside it's a knitted fabric, but on the inside it has a brushed surface. Well, that's a mechanical finish that we apply that creates these pile effects, this very, very soft and fleece-like feel on the inside. That's actually a mechanical finish that we apply after we finish knitting or even weaving the fabric. So what are the core different types of finishes? Well, on the one hand, we have either mechanical or chemical finishes. Mechanical finishes are physical finishes that are applied using machinery. So in the case of fleecing, there's these very, very sharp blades that run across the surface of the fabric that agitate the fabric, that cause the yarns to actually pile up and create this fleece effect. On the other hand, we have our chemical finishes. These can be things like washes that we apply, like a hydrogen peroxide wash. The hydrogen peroxide wash is an anti-odor wash, and it prevents the buildup of bacteria and ultimately the buildup of smells on the surface of the fabric. So there are a ton of different things you can do. And again, we've done separate episodes in the past on my top functional finishes to be using, but just know you can achieve water resistance, anti-odor resistance, you can achieve anti-flame resistance, you can achieve anti-soil, anti-wrinkle, anti-sanitization resistance, just a ton of great things. And that is the beautiful world of textiles. Textile technology is improving year in, year out, and honestly, the sky's the limit. Adding on to our different finishes, we have either our permanent finishes or our semi-permanent finishes. So permanent finishes are finishes that once applied onto the fabric are permanent. They're also irreversible, so they can be washed off and they can be removed. These are things like a peaching effect. A lot of fabrics, especially in sportswear, that are made out of polyester, to avoid having that overly slick and plasticky feel, are brushed lightly along the surface of the fabric, which again agitates the fabric, causes the yarns to pile up, and creates this fuzzy peach-like effect. This is a mechanical finish that's also irreversible, so it's a permanent finish. On the flip side, if you apply a hydrogen peroxide wash, this usually is rated for 50 washes or 100 washes. So it's a chemical finish that is also a semi-permanent finish. So it's timed. It will run out over time as you begin to wash and use your garment more and more. There's also finishes you can apply to soften up the fabric. Sometimes these types of finishes tend to be semi-permanent. If you've ever been to H&M or Zara and you've gotten a shirt that's extremely soft, it's extremely plush, you've worn it once or twice and you've washed it, and all of a sudden it's a piece of cardboard. Well, that's why they're using semi-permanent finishes to create this touch and this feel to lure you in, to get your money, and then voila. So you have all of this amazing information about fabrics. You know what the construction life cycle of a fabric is. You know what are the different families of fibers that you can use. You know what are the different construction techniques. How do you use all of this information and congregate it together? Well, the easiest way to think about it is the last time you picked up a favorite shirt and you've looked at the care label. You've seen, okay, this is a 100% cotton shirt. Well, what does that mean exactly? When it comes to specifying fabrics, there are core things that you need to mention every single time, and I'll run you through them one by one. If I really want to specify a fabric, I want to be able to relay information to a supplier. Well, this is the core information I'm going to mention. I'm not only going to say that this is a 100% cotton shirt. What I will say is this is 100% cotton. And I'll also specify what type of cotton. Is it organic cotton? Is it combed cotton? Is it Pima cotton? Is it double combed cotton? These staples or these actual yarn configurations have so much to do with the final result. Pima cotton is much softer because of the longer staple length than traditional cotton. So that's number one. You specify the fiber composition and its percentage. If there's 2 fibers, you specify both fibers. If there's 95% cotton and 5% spandex, you put 95 first and then 5% next. Then you move on to the actual fabric weight. What is the weight of the fabric? Obviously, a hoodie fabric that is made out of 100% cotton is going to be much heavier than a t-shirt fabric or a tank top fabric that's made out of 100% cotton. How do we specify this? Well, we use a universal measure that is called GSM, or grams per square meter. And really what it is how heavy 1 square meter of that specific fabric is. So a hoodie fabric would be 300 GSM versus a t-shirt fabric is going to range between 150 all the way to 200 GSM. And of course, this difference in weight needs to be specified to get your thickness across. Then we move into the construction technique. What is the construction technique we're using? Are we weaving or are we knitting? If we're weaving, is it a single jersey? Is it a double jersey? Well, it's important to specify because the performance of each is going to be extremely different. And if we're weaving, what type of weave are we using? Is it a plain weave? Is it a basket weave? So on and so forth. When it comes to weaving, I also like to specify the thickness of the threads used, because you actually have what is known as a weft and a warp construction. You have threads going in the left to right direction and the up and down direction. These different threads can actually have different thicknesses and the finished effect will actually differ. So what we do is we specify the thickness of the thread. The unit of measurement for thickness is called denier. This is the thickness of the thread, and it's typically specified as weft versus warp. And usually what we have is something like 50D for the weft and 50D for the warp, and that's how we specify it. Or it could be 100D for the weft and 200D for the warp. You'll actually be able to see the thickness of the threads. If you ever looked at your backpack, the straps are usually 600D or 700D or 800D. They're very thick. You can see each individual yarn versus something like my pants that I'm wearing, which are wool. The thread fineness is going to be much thinner, and you're not going to be able to see the individual weft and the warp yarns. And the last thing you want to mention is any functional, aesthetic, or hand feel finishes. So if your fabric is going to be water resistant, you'll want to mention it's a water resistant functional finish. Or if it's going to have a peach effect, you'll want to mention that it's a peached double or single finish depending on your actual fabric. So that's pretty much it. It's a lot to take in, but if you follow this step by step, you'll be a master at specifying fabrics. Well guys, that is it. That is a wrap on this episode. This has been my definitive guide on understanding fabrics from start to finish. Honestly, who needs university when you have Fittdesign TV? Because by the end of this episode, you should be a master at all things textiles. Of course, there's always more to learn, so check out our channel. We have a ton of great content on there for you guys. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Fittdesign TV. Until next week's episode, stay awesome.